Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed colleagues, welcome. I am Dr. Sue Onslow, and it's my pleasure to chair this session on Zimbabwe and the Commonwealth, and to welcome three experts on Zimbabwe as our panelists. We have speaking today Professor Brian Raftopoulos, who is Senior Research Fellow, Nelson Mandela School of Public Governance at the University of Cape Town. Also, Ms. Lucy Slack, who is Secretary General of the Commonwealth Local Government Forum, and Mr. Andrew McConey, Director of the Zimbabwe Electoral Support Network. I think that it's going to be a very interesting and wide-ranging discussion because we will be focusing today upon Zimbabwe's application for readmission into the Commonwealth. It began this process with a formal application to rejoin in 2018, as you will all know, and this process is ongoing. However, it has been argued that Zimbabwe should not be permitted to rejoin, as at the moment that it does not meet the required standards in respect of its human rights record, democratic processes, institutions, and the rule of law. Now, of course, there are criteria for membership for the Commonwealth. These criteria were agreed in 2007, the so-called Patterson Committee report, which was endorsed at the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in Uganda in 2007. And the applicant countries should, and I list, have a historic constitutional association with an existing Commonwealth member. They should accept and comply with Commonwealth fundamental values, principles, and priorities set out in the 1971 Declaration of Commonwealth Principles, of course signed in Singapore, and subsequent declarations. The country should demonstrate a commitment to democracy and democratic processes, including free and fair elections and representative legislatures. The rule of law and independence of the judiciary is also crucial. Good governance, including a well-trained public service and transparent public accounts. And also crucially, the protection of human rights, freedom of expression, and equal opportunity. The applicant should also accept Commonwealth norms and conventions. Now, along with these criteria, the Commonwealth has set out a four-part process for joining, or indeed rejoining, following that formal expression of interest. So Zimbabwe has followed this process of an informal assessment undertaken by the Secretary General. There's been consultation by Secretary General Patricia Scotland with member states. There's been an invitation to Zimbabwe to make a formal application, and also the formal application should present evidence of the functioning of the democratic processes and popular support in that country for rejoining. Now, as you will all know, that in November of last year, the Assistant Secretary General, Professor Louis Franceschi, made a visit to Zimbabwe and met with a variety of official government cabinet ministers, opposition members, and stakeholders across civil society to assess whether Zimbabwe has made sufficient progress towards the stipulated reforms. That report has not yet been published, and there is keen interest in what that assessment process has been and at what point is Zimbabwe judged to have reached. So I think this conversation today is particularly timely so that we can air the issues widely. Professor Raftopoulos, if I could invite you, please, to make your remarks, and then it will be followed by Ms. Lucy Slack, and then followed by Andrew. Brian, over to you. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Sue, and thank you for the invitation to join this discussion. I think it's very timely. Let me just say that one clear process is emerging in Zimbabwe, that since the November 27 coup, there is a deepening authoritarianism growing in Zimbabwe. It's got even deeper than under the Mugabe regime. And what we are seeing at the moment is a process of systematically attempting to dismantle the opposition, as well as to close down space for civil society activists. And it's taken a number of forms. One is obviously the use of the judiciary, both to remove Chamisa on his initial presidency of what was the MDCT, and then the setting up of an alternative MDC under Douglas Monzora, which is more amenable to ZANU-PF and more of an appendage to ZANU-PF at the moment. the initial removal of 28 MPs and 105 local councillors, who then had to go for a by-election, the creation of a political political actors dialogue POLAG, which is totally controlled by ZANU-PF, and it's included only parties that have no serious representation in the electorate. The violence against opposition party members, the violence, the arrest that has been taking place since the post-election period in 2018, the arrests of journalists, civil society activists, the gender violence that is taking place as well. And then, of course, the important imposition of a few legislative introductions, such as the Private Voluntary Organ Amendment Bill, which is effectively the most comprehensive policing act against civil society that we've seen in Zimbabwe in the post-colonial period. It will effectively give the state the ability to enter and take control of any civil society organization that it considers a threat. And it places massive control over funding, over resources, over the board even. They can even take over control of the board if they feel it's a threat to the state. Then there's the Criminal Law Codification and Reform Amendment Bill, otherwise known as the Patriot Bill, which effectively illegalizes Zimbabwean citizens from speaking critically about the Zimbabwean state to foreign governments. So if you are talking about sanctions to foreign governments, you can effectively be arrested, you can have your citizenship withdrawn. It again is part of this. We've also seen the increasing use of the Maintenance of Peace and Security Act as what has been called by the Zimbabwe Lawyers for Human Rights, the weapon of choice to prosecute citizens. And it's an echo of the Smith regime's use of the Law and Order Maintenance Act. So we see a raft of measures which have been put in place to effectively dismantle opposition, to close down civic space, and a deepening of authoritarian rule from the time of continuing what Mugabe began during his time. We've also seen, of course, the recent delimitation report that has come out, which has been heavily criticized on a technical basis for not going beyond the 20% prescribed for each constituency, not the improper use of census data, and which would effectively, if it's implemented in its current form, will give more seats to ZANU-PF. So already the election is in doubt. Just to move beyond that to the regional part of this, part of the narrative of the Mnangagwa regime, continuing from the Mugabe regime, has been to use the sanctions debate to keep SADC within its framework, to say that sanctions are a regime change operation carried out by Western imperialist countries, and therefore we have to stand against it. And SADC have consistently stood behind both Mugabe and Mnangagwa on the sanctions question, so that this part of the narrative of sanctions, anti-sanctions, is used as a legitimation tool by Mnangagwa to carry out the kind of authoritarian politics that we are seeing. Now, of course, there's a problem with the sanctions, both because there's double standards on the part of the West with regard to some of these issues, and because, of course, we see that governments in Africa and elsewhere see they have more options now with the kind of multilateralism at international level, with China and Russia emerging, and they feel they have access to those resources, and therefore they can get away with a greater amount of authoritarian rule because they have greater leverage to negotiate at different levels with different powers at an international level. And so the sanctions feeds into this broader leverage that the authoritarian regimes feel they have to carry out the kind of politics that they're doing and get away with it. And certainly within SADC, there is no appetite at the moment to take on the Zimbabwe issue. The South Africans who used to have soft power on this issue no longer have it because of their own existential crisis of the ANC that we are seeing now. And there's no other country which will take a lead, as some did in 2007 before the election of 2008, which just simply will not see that coming out of SADC at the moment. So the Mnangagwa regime has nothing to worry about in the region or on the African or in the AU. As I said, they feel they have greater leverage at international level now. And so they feel they have greater ability to carry out the comprehensive anti-democratic politics that we are seeing. I think for the Commonwealth, this has to be a clear sounding board that if you're going to allow this kind of thing to happen, then there will be consequences for the Commonwealth. It will open up a whole new set of possibilities for authoritarian regimes to be able to get away with this kind of politics in the current context. But there's one option I think they have. After the 2018 elections, the Motlanthe Commission, as you know, was set up to look into the violence. And among the things that the Motlanthe Commission recommended were compensation for victims of violence, comprehensive implementation of the Political Parties Code of Conduct, strict enforcement of law and order, and a nation-building and reconciliation process. None of those issues have been dealt with by the Zimbabwe government. In fact, they've deepened the problems around those very issues. So I think the Commonwealth could start off by saying, look, if you are so concerned about coming back into the Commonwealth, then, and you see the sanctions as being problematic, then let's have a regional discussion. Let SADC and the Commonwealth have a regional discussion about the Motlanthe Commission proposals, which were not taken forward, and how, if these are taken forward, you might move beyond the sanctions question by dealing with these very democratic problems, which in the first place led to those sanctions coming upon the Zimbabwe government. So I would say they should be looking at what's already on the table, which hasn't been implemented, and see that as a way to get a regional discussion on Zimbabwe, including international players, and see how the process can be moved forward. But simply letting back Zimbabwe into the Commonwealth without dealing these issues is only going to make the problem even deeper and more difficult to rectify. Thank you, Sue. Let me stop there.
Thank you very much indeed, Brian. So if I could just follow up, please, abusing the privileges of the chair. You see this more as a regional engagement rather than putting in Commonwealth election observation groups with the forthcoming elections. You think that there is a necessity to engage with the regional dynamics and the regional discussion about this?
I think you can do both. You can do the election monitoring, although at this stage, I think you're going to have to look very close at the delimitation process. But also, as I said, there have been discussions on Zimbabwe in the region which were not taken forward. Reopen those discussions and say, look, we want to bring Zimbabwe back into the international discussion, but there are these issues which you yourself as a region put on the agenda and they've not been dealt with. So how do we move forward together? And that way, maybe that could trigger something in SADC, or at least open up a broader debate and get civil society organizations involved in that discussion as well.
Thank you very much indeed, Brian. Of course, the Secretary General, Patricia Scotland, has said that the Commonwealth will not send an election observation team to Zimbabwe for the next elections because Zimbabwe is not a member of the Commonwealth. However, back in the 2018, of course, it was the British and Australian governments that did provide the financial support for that. So I wonder if there's a possibility of reconsideration of another Commonwealth election observation group going.
Yeah.
Thank you very much indeed, Brian. Lucy, if I could invite you to make your remarks, please.
Thanks very much, Sue, and thanks very much for the invitation to join this discussion, and thanks for that opening, Brian. I think that was a really useful context setter. I want to take a slightly different approach in my remarks. I represent an organisation called the Commonwealth Local Government Forum. We're one of the associated Commonwealth organisations. We bring together individual cities, local government associations, ministries of local governments, and academic and research partners to support and promote local democracy and to build the capacity of local government. And we've maintained an ongoing engagement with our members at local government level, with our partners at local government level in Zimbabwe. They're not members of CLGF in line with the Commonwealth protocols, as they're not sort of part of the Commonwealth, but we've maintained a close relationship over many years. In fact, we were actively delivering a project on local democracy in 2002, 2003, which we had to kind of pivot a little bit at the time that Zimbabwe left the Commonwealth, but we have continued to engage and have a long relationship with local government. And of course, I think, you know, when Zimbabwe left the Commonwealth, I think a lot of people were very concerned in terms of the people of Zimbabwe and what that meant for them, whether they were still kind of allied and engaged with the Commonwealth. And you mentioned it a little bit yourself, Stu, in your kind of opening. And I think where we are as an organization is really recognizing that democracy is obviously much more than what happens in elections, although I absolutely respect all of the points that Brian was making in his opening remarks, but thinking also about service delivery on the ground around supporting community engagement and around maintaining some kind of engagement on issues of governance, good governance, etc. So I want to just say a few words about some of the projects that we've been working on in Zimbabwe over this period, obviously made much more complicated by the political changes, the political ramifications, but also by COVID, and just really to kind of like link that back to some of the major challenges that we see. So I think when we started our work, there were sort of three reasons really that kind of like really kind of guided us. One was focusing on what people were saying were the problems in Zimbabwe. So, you know, it will come as absolutely no surprise to anyone on this call. You know, weak governance, corruption, and suspension of officials were the most cited reasons for poor service delivery by stakeholders at the local level. You know, things just weren't working. Because of the problems politically, the impact that was having on the ground. So our work has very much focused on how we can actually sort of support and reinforce some of those institutions of local government, but also how we can support community engagement with their local authorities and improve in the context of that the kind of accountability of local government to citizens. Because, you know, I genuinely believe that, you know, the more exclusion, the more we're losing some of these principles of good governance, which we know were embedded in society in Zimbabwe before. And I think it's only the resilience really of the Zimbabwe people that's maintained that to the degree that it has been maintained. So I think we really do need to try and balance those expectations, the needs of local communities, with the needs of the international community, and think about the role that the international community can play in terms of opening up a little bit more and democratizing a little bit more that development space, and the role both in terms of push and pull that the international community can play, and not to underestimate the value of exposure and the value of seeing what's happening in other places for citizens to be able to try and hold as far as possible their governments to account. So we've been working very much on very practical things at the local government level. So you asked me just to say a little bit about this, I will. The first area has been around service delivery and benchmarking, really knowing what local government should be doing, could be doing, and what citizens can use to hold their local governments to account. We've put in place various different kind of systems for local governments to go through to actually help them report back to citizens. Linked to that, we've set up a kind of whole digital way of managing finances and managing your budget planning for your local projects, more around helping local governments to actually focus more around project-based budgeting, around how they're delivering based on local needs and local priorities. The third area has been very much in the governance space around local ward-based profiling, actually making sure that there's a direct correlation between what citizens say that they want and say that they need, going into the plans that local councils are putting in place, and ultimately the service delivery, trying to build up as far as we can that trust between local citizens and their local councils. Linked to that, we've been working around mainstreaming gender. Obviously, you know, in Zimbabwe, even under this project, engagement with women has been quite low, only around the sort of 30% mark, even in sort of community consultation and engagement. It's definitely an area where we absolutely need to do more. It is interesting that the government has moved the quota for at least 30% of women to also include local government. That was very much as a result of a kind of collective effort driven by women in Zimbabwe. And then finally around local economic development. So bringing all of those component parts together to look at how local government can sort of build and support the local economy. Obviously, there have been huge challenges in that. COVID has been one of them. The issues around managing that kind of multi-party arrangement, issues around corruption, but I think we have been able to genuinely show that there is engagement, there is community engagement, there is an interest in local communities to be part of that process, and there is a definite value in terms of working at that local level. I think in terms of just in sort of summing up a little bit, I think there is this risk of kind of like further radicalization, further sort of pushing Zimbabwe out. I think that it does push Zimbabwe in other directions. And I think, you know, a kind of process of much more kind of engagement, you know, very much in line with normal Commonwealth principles is something that we might want to think about a little bit more. I think that obviously, we have to follow the Commonwealth process. We have to see what comes out of the Commonwealth process in terms of the next steps that we want to take. And I wonder whether there's also more that we could do as organizations that have a strong interest in Zimbabwe in providing support to our members on the ground. But I think really the main message that I just wanted to leave is really recognizing that those issues of democracy and good governance are more than just what happens in elections. And I know obviously the election is inevitably going to be a major focus, and it has to be, it's critically important. It will be critically important for us in terms of what happens next as well. We'll be watching it very closely, but also really trying to build and inculcate that democratic culture throughout society is critically important. And I think there is a role potentially for the Commonwealth to play. And I think just in terms of just touching a little bit on that new bill, the PCVO, I think the one thing that I would say is obviously for any kind of successful local democracy, good governance at the local level, space for civil society to play a role is critically important. Civil society plays an important role in terms of holding local government to account. So, you know, clearly that is a major concern in terms of the future of local democracy as well in the Commonwealth. Thanks, Sue.
Thank you very much indeed, Lucy. So I was just curious whether the delimitation bill also affects the allocation size of ward level, because that is where, in terms of local government structures, of local government democracy, how far is your organization affected by that? Or is the greater focus of the changing boundaries of the constituencies at national and provincial level? And so the ward level issue is not so pressing.
I suspect, I mean, I don't know exactly, but I suspect that will impact at all levels, because obviously it will be a tripartite election. So I'm sure it will have an impact at all levels. I think, you know, our engagement has been much more from the sort of technical perspective around how do we actually use those ward groupings to support local development. But obviously, if you know, the bill will have an impact on that. Likewise, I suspect around some of the quota arrangements as well, and I'm sure Andrew may well touch on some of those in his presentation next.
Okay, Lucy, thank you very much indeed. Andrew, if I could invite you to make your remarks, please. Thank you, Lucy.
Thank you, Sue, and once again, thank you for inviting me to be part of the panel to discuss this very important topic. Zimbabwe Election Support Network, where I come from, was formed in 2000. It's a coalition of 37 NGOs organized to coordinate activities around elections. And we do so through monitoring and observing of elections, advocating for electoral reforms, coordinating civic and voter education, as well as gathering and disseminating of information that is critical to stakeholders as they prepare towards elections. And when I look at where we've come from in terms of the disengagement by Zimbabwe from the Commonwealth, I think the starting point is that Zimbabwe was not expelled from the Commonwealth. It was a unilateral act of withdrawing from the Commonwealth following a suspension. And when the suspension was being extended, that is when Zimbabwe decided on the 7th of December 2003 to disengage from the Commonwealth and to quote Robert Mugabe, then the late President of the Republic of Zimbabwe. He said that this is it. It's quits and quits it will be. That is what he signed off when we left the Commonwealth. So we voluntarily withdrew, and unfortunately quits it was, and it was a unilateral decision. However, when we are talking about rejoining the Commonwealth, it's no longer a unilateral act. It's not in Zimbabwe's remit. It is something which is the responsibility of...
You need to rewind by about 500 words, Andrew. I apologize.
Okay, sorry about that. This is technology. I was talking about the benchmarks which the Commonwealth itself set to ensure that the members who join the Commonwealth would indeed fit in the organization. And this democracy, respect of human rights, respect of the rule of law, promoting international peace and security, respecting and facilitating the participation of civic society organizations in the governance of the country member states. So these are the benchmarks which I want to believe, the script is marked against. And when the Commonwealth delegation visited our country, this is exactly what they were looking for. Did they get a sense that we have done so much between 2018 and now to deserve to be readmitted into the Commonwealth? I think it is a verdict which the team which visited Zimbabwe must, and unfortunately, it has not shared its results with the rest of us. So we are in the dark as to what is happening. But fast forward in terms of what confronts us at the moment, we are going to have elections in the next 6 or so months in our country. But our assessment of the pre-election environment is that we still have a polarized and divided country, divided largely on political lines. There are concerns over the right to freedom of peaceful assembly and to association. We have seen increased cases of political violence, taking place in the country. And as a result, we have not moved an inch from experiences during past elections where violence precedes elections, and perhaps you get a kind of a peaceful environment only on election day. This is what we've been experiencing in the past. What we are seeing, statements, videos circulating on social media, is again a situation where it will be difficult for the opposition to be able to penetrate, particularly in the rural areas, because of threats of violence and because of actual violence which is now being experienced in most of these communities. We've also, seen that there's not much happening again in terms of reform, electoral reform. Currently, there is an electoral bill which is before Parliament, and in a sense, the bill is not dealing with substantive issues. It's addressing nominal administrative reforms which do not really increase or improve the democratic space. We're looking, for instance, for issues to do with the right to vote and the inclusivity. We were campaigning since 2018 that our citizens in the diaspora be allowed to vote, but that bill does not contain anything of that sort. It addresses very, very small issues that are inconsequential, really, when one looks at it. We had issues to do with the role of traditional leaders in past elections, influencing how elections are conducted in our country. Again, it's an issue which we thought was going to be addressed in this new proposed electoral amendment to the Electoral Act, but that is not happened. In terms of the media space, again, the media is also paralyzed. We also see that right of access to public broadcasting services is really curtailed, especially when it comes to opposition political figures. It favors the incumbents who enjoy the greater share of access on public broadcasting services, while it's the opposition when they appear in those media spaces, the stories will be in the negative. So those are some of the issues which have been confronting us in previous elections, and we see the same thing happening. Regarding the delimitation report, there were issues really when it came out. So many people complained that how the process panned out was not democratic, and the result is so distorted. It's not reflective of transparency in the manner in which it ought to have been carried out. We, for instance, we're unclear how they came out with the new boundaries. There were issues to do, as Brian indicated, with the right sizing the boundaries and the formula which was used by ZEC, which appeared to then disadvantage opposition political parties going into the election. For instance, we believe that Harare lost or is going to lose more than about four seats as a result of this delimitation exercise. When in fact, if the proper calculation of representativeness, Harare would have resulted in them gaining 4 instead of the 2 they are going to gain through this delimitation exercise. So these are the challenges that confront us, and we do not believe that we are heading towards an election that may result in a credible an election that could be in the end seen as credible by the international community and by us in the country. So those are the challenges which we are seeing at the moment.
Andrew, thank you very much indeed. Before we started this call, we were discussing the biometric voters roll. Could you just explain to those on the call who may not be aware of this, the limited access to the BVR and the cost of accessing the electronic roll?
Yes, thank you, Sue. In terms of the voters, so just before the delimitation exercise was carried out, there was a voter registration blitz that took place, and after that blitz, a voters roll was then prepared. It was supposed, in my view, in the interests of transparency and accountability, and in terms of the law, to be open for members to citizens to be able to have access to it electronically and be able to, to comment on whether that voters roll is representative. But the challenge is we had is that the electronic voters roll is not available for the public to be able to access. What was offered was a physical copy of a voters roll, and it comes at a huge price. It comes at a cost, I understand, I stand corrected, is about $187,000. That will be the cost of accessing that if you are not a candidate, and if you are we are outside of the electoral period. Of course, it has been indicated that candidates would be able to access voters rolls specific for their wards and perhaps constituencies at the right time closer to the election. But we need to be able to look at the voters roll now and to prepare for an election aware of exactly the numbers that are there, whether it's accurately representative as shown in the delimitation of constituencies. So at the moment we have a preliminary delimitation report but we do not have the data in terms of having an electoral voters roll to then compare what the delimitation result is against the number of registered voters in particular constituencies as seen in the voters roll. So those are the challenges with the current situation. We can't access an electronic copy. We requested for it and we have not been able to access it.
Thank you very much indeed, Andrew. Brian, if I could put a question to you, please. Could you elaborate on the extent to which that the judiciary and indeed the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission has been politicized? Because one of the core requirements in the Commonwealth is, under the Latimer House principles, is for the independence of the rule of law. And also that, and in other Commonwealth protocols, of course, that the election commission should be an independent body for the oversight of running of elections. Could you comment on the extent to which the institution of law and ZEC have been politicized?
Thanks, Sue. Well, as many scholars have noted, there has been an increasing control of the judiciary by the ruling party from the Mugabe period. And that really, again, has deepened under the military regime of Mnangagwa. And so although, of course, there are still professionals within the judicial system who try and fight for the autonomy of that space, but as a whole, and particularly at the high levels where the people that are put in those positions are controlled by the presidency and the top leadership of ZANU-PF, we've seen there's increasing politicization of the judiciary. And definitely ZEC is not an independent body. It's a body that's very much under the control of the ruling party. That even as we saw, there are some members of ZEC who did not sign off on this recent delimitation. They themselves had problems with it, and yet it went through to the presidency. And so we have, at least in the chair, in the person of the chair, someone who's very much under the control of the presidency and ZANU-PF. And there's no way you can expect such an organization to carry out the kind of independent role that it should do as set out in the Constitution.
No, thank you very much indeed. Lucy, you emphasized very much in your remarks that the Commonwealth Local Government Forum has been focusing on technical delivery of building governance capacity. Over the time, in the last 4 years, now coming up to 5 years since the last election, has there been, in your view, a diminution of the space that the CLGF has been able to enjoy? I'm just wondering whether, in fact, the technical delivery, the technical support has also been compromised, because I'm listening to Brian's remarks, to Andrew's remarks, and it seems that there has been a closing of the space. And has there been a closing of the space of the way that in which the technical delivery and support to Zimbabwean citizens? I'm sorry, Lucy,
Yes, there has. Sorry about that. I would say definitely, and I would say that there definitely have been situations where, for example, as Brian mentioned in his opening, councillors have been dismissed for political reasons, political purposes, and obviously, you need your councillors as well as you need your technical staff. But equally, I would say that in terms of the nature of what we've been doing at the very local level, it's possibly also helped to open the eyes of local citizens to what the potential is and what they can expect more from their local authority. So I would say it's a flip situation. It's a little bit of both. There have certainly been areas where space has been much more limited, or where there's been a lot of political interference in particular areas. But equally, I think by working at the very local level, at the ward level, and by having this link through to what we've been doing around also thinking about the finances and the revenue mobilization of the local authority, and creating that connection between the decisions that the council are taking, the things that the council are investing in, being linked to things that the council have, the wards members have identified themselves, has, I think, also helped to strengthen some of those principles of local governance, and actually understanding a bit better how it's possible to hold your local government more to account. So I would say a bit of both, if I'm absolutely honest.
Okay, thank you. But as you outlined, that there are still considerable challenges embedded in the structures in the system. Andrew, if I could ask you, please, you mentioned that ZESN set up in 2000 as a coalition of 37 NGOs. How much pushback is there within the space in Zimbabwe against the PVOA legislation? I mean, is there any space to present the counter arguments, or in fact, given the dominance of ZANU-PF in both the National Assembly and also the Senate, that this legislation is going to steam through and it will be on the statute book?
Oh, thank you. So, in fact, what has since happened is that despite all protestations from civil society organizations and citizens, the bill has already passed through the House of Assembly as well as in the Senate. So it's done and dusted at the moment, and unless the president withdraws his consent, does not sign that bill into law, it means that you know, the PVO bill becomes law, and you know, what we fear the most, which is the shrinking democratic space, will happen because of this development. Our plea is that perhaps the president, you know, re-looks at it and sees sense in not signing it into law. This is not the first time this has happened. In 2004, Parliament passed the NGO bill into law, but I think eventually when President Robert Mugabe, the late, you know, a time to reflect on the implications of the NGO bill, which had now been passed in the two houses, he decided not to sign, and that silenced the NGO Act. So, you know, our prayer, and although the hopes are fast dwindling, is that perhaps the president might not sign it into law. But, you know, judging from the statements we've been seeing in the press, this is already water under the bridge. And in the next few days or weeks, we could see that bill gazetted into law. And it will have implications in the operations of NGOs. For starters, you can be called upon by the registrar to register under the PVO Act. And once you are under the purview of the PVO Act, there are so many implications. It will be very difficult for you to fundraise for your activities. It will also be very difficult for NGOs to access finance. As you well know, in state of Zimbabwe, the government itself does not support the work of or resource the work of NGOs. So NGOs have been surviving from international support, more or less, both those who are involved in humanitarian work and those who are involved in the governance and human rights area. So what I foresee is that some organizations may be allowed to register, while those organizations that are deemed too political or too close to opposition politics may not then get registered. So these are the challenges that confront us now. We are uncertain as to where we will be come March or April this year.
Thank you very much indeed. And is the same true of the Patriot Bill that Brian made reference to, that would criminalize or would allow the possibility of criminal action, or to bring a criminal action against someone who was deemed to have brought Zimbabwe into disrepute or to have criticized the government or the president? Is that also passed into law?
that has not yet passed into law, but the bill has been introduced in the law house. So it's being debated. Again, when it is passed into law, it will have so many implications. When you are invited to forums like this, you think twice, because you don't know how twisted or how they will twist what you would have submitted, as if you are being unpatriotic, and you then end up now being the subject of prosecution. So the aim really is to silence dissent. And is it one of the objectives of the Commonwealth to silence dissent in the country, or the Commonwealth encourages constructive criticism of any member state by its citizens?
Well, Article 5 of the Commonwealth Charter, which of course was signed in 2013, sets out right of freedom of expression and also the freedom of information, which is guaranteed under the UN Declaration of Rights. So it's Article 19. So, I mean, as you say, that these are very disturbing pieces of legislation which seem to be heading for the statute book. You've made reference to PVOA being on the statute book, barring the president's assent, but also the implications for the quote Patriots Bill. I'm now going to go to questions from the floor, please. Question from Dr. Nicholas Watts for the panelists. What implications does the admission of Togo and Gabon to the Commonwealth at the Kigali summit in June of 2022 have on Zimbabwe reforming its democratic processes in advance of the application? This has been one of the arguments, that if Togo and Gabon have been admitted to the Commonwealth, each of which have, shall we say, challenges around human rights records, around democracy and good governance, why then should Zimbabwe be refused admission? Brian, if I could put that question to you, do you feel that developments elsewhere in Africa and inclusion in the Commonwealth have undermined, in fact, the Commonwealth formal processes of meeting benchmarks? That the Commonwealth is not, it's got double standards here. So why should Zimbabwe be excluded?
Indeed, that appears to be the case. And it's the kind of case that the Zimbabwe government would make and say, yeah, this is the double standards that we're talking about, and that the Commonwealth has really lowered the levels in terms of participation. And I think it's a real challenge. And as I said, it's also because I think the Commonwealth is caught up in the current global politics, where it's looking also not to lose influence, what little influence it may have, to other countries who are emerging on the African continent, China, Russia, and so are open to more compromises on this particular point. And that's exactly the calculation that the Mnangagwa regime will have made in terms of its application to re-enter.
Thank you very much, Brian. Lucy, what are your thoughts on that question?
I mean, I tend to agree with what Brian has just said largely. I mean, I think the key is probably waiting to see what does come out of the Commonwealth assessment in terms of rejoining. I mean, I haven't been privy to the report that's come out of the recent visit that Luis has made to Zimbabwe. I haven't seen that. I haven't seen the sort of nature of the direction that that's taking, but it does seem to me to be it does seem to me to be kind of like broadening the gateposts, if we put it like that, and possibly introducing that argument. And I've heard that being used quite extensively. I've heard it in many kind of discussions. But I think what we probably need to also be pushing for is, and I also don't know what the kind of arrangements have been between the Commonwealth Secretariat, Togo and Gabon, in terms of their commitments to delivering on those kind of commitments to human rights, good governance, the rule of law, and how far there's a process that the Commonwealth Secretariat is supporting as part of that. And that's just because I'm not close enough to what the Commonwealth is doing in that regard. So I wouldn't like to kind of like, criticize it unduly, but I certainly think it opens up the opportunity to use that argument to the favor of the current government in Zimbabwe.
Thank you. Andrew, what's your view from Harare on that particular argument?
Yeah, I tend to agree with my two fellow panelists that the fact that Gabon and Togo, with their own challenges, which are not very different from what we experience here in Zimbabwe, were admitted in 2022. That then would then appear to be a contradiction if the Commonwealth was to say that we cannot admit Zimbabwe until it meets certain benchmarks, when perhaps they overlooked those benchmarks when admitting Togo and Gabon. But my take is, especially for Zimbabwe, is that we are going into an election, and I think it's an opportunity, if the Commonwealth is still assessing the country, for the Commonwealth to then insist that Zimbabwe must hold peaceful and credible elections as one of those conditions for Zimbabwe to be admitted. Nothing stops that. You are a club, the Commonwealth is a club. It can decide to admit or not to admit a member, whether the member is rogue or not. But for a Commonwealth which has been following developments in the country and are eager to see a member that conforms to its own standards, I would want to believe that there's still room for the Commonwealth to then indicate that for you to become a member of the Commonwealth, for your application to be approved, you should have demonstrated A, B, C, D, E. Whether or not that happened for Togo and Gabon, I'm not sure, but I think certainly something which the Commonwealth can look at. As I indicated at the beginning, Zimbabwe was not expelled. Zimbabwe voluntarily left the Commonwealth. It could have been actually a unilateral decision of the president then, and which disadvantaged so many Zimbabweans. But again, once you leave a club and you want to rejoin that same club, you then have to conform to to the dictates of that particular club.
Thank you very much indeed. There are two questions next on the question of election observation. Commonwealth decision not to observe elections for a prospective new member on the grounds it's not a member seems quite odd, from Ricardo Kirelli and also Dr. Peter Henshaw in Ottawa. Are the panelists able to comment more about the thinking within the Commonwealth Secretariat on readmission generally and election observation in particular? I don't believe, Dr. Henshaw, that we will be able to, because none of us, I include myself, are privy to the discussions inside the Commonwealth Secretariat. But Dr. Henshaw goes on to say, we in Ottawa are under the impression Commonwealth observation at the next election is under serious consideration. In that there was particular importance attached to election observation back in 2018. What are the panelists going to, can they make comments on whether they feel that this would be an appropriate oversight mission, or whether in fact, given the role of SADC, EU, if invited, and the AU sending observation missions, would they be sufficient? Brian, your comments about election observation.
Look, I think that if the Commonwealth is considering this application, it would be good for them to be on the ground to see what's going on and get on the ground quite early, not late. Get on the ground as soon as possible and find out as much as you can about what's happening within communities, how the election process is being handled in terms of the media, in terms of the delimitation issue, in terms of the treatment of opposition and civic activists. So I think, it would be a good way to begin their assessment or to continue their ongoing assessment. I doubt we'll get much criticism of the process from either SADC or the AU. They will do what they usually do, which is merely confirm the outcome, even if they have a few small reservations. They will solidify the position of the current regime. And then even if the EU has reservations and problems, it won't do much to change that situation on its own. So I come back to my point that there's got to be some way to get a broader discussion with the region, with the Commonwealth, with international players around issues which were raised by the SADC region itself. and both around sanctions, but also around the commission after the 2018 elections, which have not been dealt with, which could help to encourage a broader debate to bring Zimbabwe back in a much stronger, much healthier way into this into the Commonwealth and other international agreements.
Brian, if I could just take the next question because it follows on from your remarks. You mentioned that South Africa has lost its soft power in relation to influencing Zimbabwe because of the internal crisis within South Africa and within particularly the ANC. Do you see any room for relatively more moderate African nations to take up South Africa's place on this issue, such as Botswana or Zambia?
Look, we've talked about that possibility in other fora. The problem is Botswana did at one point under Kama, where it took a very critical position on the Mugabe government. And that when the position was in a sense backed by other players like South Africa in terms of the accountability around the 2008 election, it led to the global political agreement. We don't see that now because I think countries like Botswana and Zambia simply don't have the muscle within SADC at the moment, the liberation muscle, if you like, to be able to push these agendas on their own. And I don't see that they're going to be able to make much progress unless they bring in other liberation movement players. And that's unlikely to happen at this stage.
Thank you very much indeed. Andrew, if I could ask you, as the director of ZESN, what is your view about the role of external election monitoring groups? Because it was put to me by Neville Linton, who was a significant Guyanese diplomat based at the Commonwealth Secretariat in the 1980s and 1990s, that elections are stolen, quote unquote, months before the actual polling date. So given that election observation missions, when they come to a country, might have a limited budget, might only be there for a limited amount of time, do you see, in fact, a valuable role for election observation groups? Or, in fact, are they window dressing to a degree?
Thank you. When international observer mission groups come into the country on the eve of the election, that does not help much. You want a situation where once an election has been proclaimed, the election date has been proclaimed, which is usually perhaps between 3 to 6 months before an election. Already there's what I would call a long-term observer mission, a small team that then visits to have an assessment of what is happening on the ground, particularly during the campaign period, because that is when a lot of these electoral malpractices take place. On election day, nothing much happens. In fact, in most cases, it was very quiet, it was peaceful. So the voter manipulation, vote rigging, you call it, happens well before an election. And by the time international observers come in, usually it will be too late to do anything. So we always encourage international observers to send their teams early, particularly a small team that is in the country, particularly also in those areas where we believe will be highly contested, so that they're able to assess the environment and perhaps mitigate some of these challenges, because when the international community is watching certain of the challenges which we see, like violence, may actually be mitigated by their presence. But I also want to answer on the question of whether the Commonwealth should send a delegation to Zimbabwe. In 2018, the Commonwealth Observer Group was in the country, notwithstanding that Zimbabwe is not a member state of the Commonwealth. So what has changed now? In my view, that ground does not hold water. Perhaps there are other reasons, but the reason certainly is not the fact that Zimbabwe is not a member of the Commonwealth, because in 2018, the Commonwealth was in Zimbabwe to observe elections.
Indeed, and of course the Commonwealth Election Observation Group were actually in Harare when the violence immediately after the poll erupted, and that there was the shootings, in which 6 people sadly lost their lives. So yes, the Commonwealth Observation Team was able to incorporate not simply the poll, but the aftermath of the election in their report. Lucy, do you have a view, particularly on the value of election observation missions? I think I'm right in saying that you've been a member of election observation missions elsewhere, have you not?
Yes, I have, and definitely, I mean, I think that they have a very important role to play. Like Andrew, I think you do need to make sure that there's someone in country or a small group of people in country early to be able to focus on the process to the election. And I think that there's also a value, and this is something I think that the Commonwealth does do very well, of identifying practitioners who have direct experience of either running elections, monitoring elections, from civil society organizations that have responsibility of monitoring elections, and making sure that you also include in that team people from the region who understand some of the intricacies of what's happening in particular countries. I would definitely also, urge all of election monitoring teams to look at elections at all levels, because obviously, in Zimbabwe, we're focusing a lot at what happens centrally, but also there will be elections at the local level later this year. I think it's important to include them as well. And like other speakers, I think it would make sense if, as part of the sort of monitoring for Zimbabwe to come back into the Commonwealth, if there was another mission that could also look at the progress that's been made since 2018. One of the things I do know about election monitoring is that you do need an invitation from the host government, and I don't know whether there's also a timing question here. We shouldn't maybe just prejudge just yet, but it could be that because there's not a date yet, that process hasn't happened. But I know that that's also one of the requirements for election monitoring.
No, thank you very much. I'm going to try and amalgamate two questions here. The question from Dr. Mark Simpson: the economy is back in meltdown mode, creating new opportunities for massive rent seeking, the refilling of the trough through arbitrage, and then maintenance of support for key regime props. Given this, should we say that the political economy dimension, is there a space for welcoming Zimbabwe back into the Commonwealth to try to support reforms, or in fact, do you think that this is an inversion of a political process, that given the Zimbabwean situation, that there's more potential value and leverage with keeping Zimbabwe should not be allowed to be readmitted to the Commonwealth at this point, or to welcome Zimbabwe back to try to support reform and change from within the Commonwealth? Brian, what's your view of that?
I think that's being very optimistic. I very much doubt that allowing Zimbabwe back into the Commonwealth will encourage a reformist approach from this government. Their politics, their form of governance, their form of rule is deeply embedded in authoritarian forms of governance and rule. And that's unlikely to change. It may just be that there may be a few areas where they do move, but substantively, I doubt that they would move very much. And this could just be legitimizing the continuation of this kind of politics. And I just keep coming back to this. It's got to come back to a broader discussion in which we want Zimbabwe to get re-engaged, but it has to be done in ways which also ensure a deepening of democratization within the country, a respect for citizens' rights, and not the assumption that one party and one group of liberation leaders must forever rule the country because of their liberation legacy. That there's got to be an open discussion about how you, not just in Zimbabwe, but in the region. SADC has protocols around elections, SIAC, for example, where they have the right to send in long-term missions before the elections. They don't use that. There are very serious protocols within SADC which will allow it to access and to monitor the process thoroughly, but they don't do it. And they're not doing it unless there's a push from within the region. So I think just letting them into the Commonwealth and thinking that that's going to reform the kind of kleptocrats that we have ruling, I doubt that will happen.
Andrew, your thoughts, please.
Yeah, it's a difficult proposition. When I had occasion to speak to the visiting delegation in November, my take was that I think perhaps the Commonwealth process must include a kind of a provisional, admission with a clear roadmap as to what should happen when you've been provisionally accepted as a member. I get a sense that if that avenue was available for an applicant, it will then put the applicant in its right place. If the applicant would want to show commitment to the values of the Commonwealth during the provisional period, the applicant is ticking the right boxes. And then at the end of that provisional period, the applicant can then be fully admitted into the Commonwealth. But my understanding is that that provision is not in the policies of the Commonwealth. And my recommendation is that it is something that they must consider. I think it will really lessen the burden on them to admit some states that may be considered as rogue, because once you provisionally accept them, there's a roadmap to them fully comply with the provisions of the Commonwealth Charter. And if they don't, they fail. If they do, they pass and they are admitted as a full member. So that's my take to it. I think there's more that the Commonwealth needs to do to be able to ensure that the right members are attracted or are joined into the Commonwealth.
Thank you. Lucy, do you have any reflections you'd like to add to that?
Maybe just briefly, I mean, I think I'd pick up on some of those points that Andrew was making around continuous engagement. And I do think that the Commonwealth has a track record of, positive engagement, and I think has, many levers that it could potentially use to support some kind of an interim process in terms of the situation vis-a-vis Zimbabwe. And I do feel that, there is a real risk of pushing Zimbabwe even further in the direction that we see it going. And is there a role for the Commonwealth in actually helping to sort of bring that back and use some of the mechanisms that it has, some of the opportunities to use some of the soft power in the region, also other countries on the continent, to kind of push that debate around how we move collectively towards those Commonwealth principles. Because, obviously many countries are not meeting all of the Commonwealth principles right now either. It's not just one country. So it's also what are the steps that need to be taken, and can we actually use that tradition that the Commonwealth has of ongoing engagement and support to members and I guess former members as part of that process, taking on board obviously what Brian has been saying in terms of, is there room for change? And if there's a request from the Zimbabwe government that they do want to join, there's clarity over what the kind of Commonwealth principles are to rejoin the Commonwealth. Can we somehow use that to kind of broker and support that conversation more strategically?
Thank you very much. Picking up from a question in the chat with that remark, Lucy, if I could put it to all of you panelists, how much of a genuine interest in rejoining the Commonwealth do you think there really is among the ZANU-PF leadership? A question from Professor Diana Jeter. We've only heard arguments about why Zimbabwe might be saying it should be admitted and why the Commonwealth might disagree. But do you think it's possible to identify a genuine wish to re-engage with the Commonwealth at government level, across civil society organizations, also among the wider Zimbabwean population? When I was in Zimbabwe in January 2018, I picked up on a discernible undertow of resentment towards the Commonwealth from within ZANU-PF leadership, that the kind of hardcore who didn't see the need of it at all. Brian, you made reference to the transactional approach of using the Commonwealth as a way to deal with the sanctions issue. Do you feel that there's any genuine desire to re-engage with the Commonwealth, or is it just using a foreign policy tool to improve legitimacy and image in the international system?
Yeah, look, I mean, I can't say for sure, but I would say it's very much a transactional issue, that they're using this as part of a broader leverage of getting more engaged internationally, getting more legitimacy internationally, especially given the international conflicts that are taking place, and using the the need for the Commonwealth not to lose any more influence on the African continent for its own purposes. I would doubt there's very much of a genuine need to join the Commonwealth, but I do see it as part of a broader strategy of legitimation at international level, which has been in play for some time.
Yeah. Andrew, thank you very much, Brian. Andrew, what are your thoughts from your perspective in Harare?
Yeah, my thoughts are that I think this re-engagement agenda is shaped largely by government ministries that are trying to re-engage the international community, particularly the Ministry of Finance, Industry, and industry, who seem to want to find more options in terms of support to Zimbabwe, and perhaps there are genuine options available for them if they join the Commonwealth. There may be some financial kind of transactional benefits that come out of it, particularly if we could get some lines of credit from within the Commonwealth membership. So I want to believe that the push mostly came from the economic side of it. We are experiencing serious challenges in the country. The economy is faltering, and perhaps joining a community such as the Commonwealth would give us as many options as possible. Of course, we tried in the last decade or so to be engaging with the East, with China, Russia, and the like, but perhaps not much is coming out of those relationships, and there may be a look again back towards the West, and the Commonwealth could be, because it's representative of the West as well as African, Asian, and South American countries who are members of the Commonwealth. Perhaps that broader group could also give them options when it comes to looking for avenues to really contain the economic challenges the country is facing at the moment.
Thank you, Andrew. Lucy, your thoughts on that? About have the Commonwealth Local Government Forum staff on the ground been able to identify a genuine interest in rejoining the Commonwealth, or is there a degree of mystification? Is there any wider Zimbabwean desire to reconnect?
I mean, I think there is some. I couldn't measure exactly how much. And I guess as a Commonwealth organization, we've been engaging with people as a Commonwealth organization. So the feedback has been, I guess linked a little bit to us. But I think where I would say there's, more drive is, and the Commonwealth is just part of this, I think it's more about re-engaging more generally with the international community. And I think recognizing some of the things that are not coming to local people in Zimbabwe as a result of not being part of that wider kind of globalization, whether that's around personal opportunities, but also opportunities to benchmark against other countries, opportunities to kind of engage and get exposure through the kind of international networks. I think all of those are things that people, certainly the people that we're working with, genuinely would like to see more of. So I think that there is at one level, of course, there's a very strong kind of political move around perception and how things are perceived. But I think also there is a genuine groundswell around wanting to kind of engage more broadly with the international community, which is, obviously becoming more and more difficult.
In terms of the international community, do you think that the current strategic environment, okay, globally, but also particularly in Southern Africa, is also part of the equation here? Do the panelists identify any desire to, in addition to keeping all options open as much as possible, through withdrawing the Commonwealth as a soft power organization that connects West and South? Do you identify any push, any desire from outside to try to encourage Zimbabwe to come back into the Commonwealth as, to a degree, an antidote perhaps to Russia, perhaps to China? Or in fact, is this a misunderstanding of the dynamics of the situation? Brian, your thoughts? Are there any strategic dimensions which we should be thinking about in this discussion?
Yeah, look, I mean, as I've been saying, I think the Zimbabwe government is looking at it strategically in terms of global politics, in terms of possibilities. You know, the recent visit of the president of Belarus to Zimbabwe, yes, indicative of opening up the possibilities of leverage, and saying, you know, that the West and the Commonwealth are not the only people we are talking to. We're talking to a whole range of people, which is fair enough. And therefore, they see this as a moment that they have a little bit more muscle to be able to push their agenda of consolidating rule within Zimbabwe, but also getting some international leverage out of it. They feel there's opportunities now because of the state of international politics. And there's a real danger that that can happen, and that we will see an increasing legitimization of these kind of authoritarian regimes within the current polycrisis that's taking place at international level.
Thank you. Andrew, your thoughts on the strategic dimensions of Zimbabwe's current situation?
Yeah, I think perhaps some dimension to rejoining the Commonwealth thing is perhaps also an attempt to increase on the voices that may speak out against the sanctions. As you are aware, SADC and the AU are only together supporting Zimbabwe on this cause for the removal of sanctions imposed on Zimbabwe by the United Kingdom, as well as the United States. So, for instance, if Zimbabwe joins the Commonwealth, is accepted in the Commonwealth, again, it's a platform for Zimbabwe to be able to push that agenda through the Commonwealth. And you know, when the voices grow louder and louder, perhaps they will reach Downing Street, and they will reach also the states. I'm just speculating as everyone, but I want to believe it could also inform why it is in the interest of the country to rejoin the Commonwealth.
Thank you very much. There's a question about the mainstream media and the extent to which, even though 70% of it is state-controlled, is there space in mainstream media for a degree of criticism and calling the ZANU-PF government to account? So does this exist? Or in fact, given the state control of, be it TV channels, radio stations, and also online platforms, and its ability to survey the digital space as well, is there any space at all for criticism of the government and to promote transparency? Andrew, your thoughts?
Thank you. When I look at the media as it currently is in Zimbabwe, especially the developments over the last a few years, I've seen that less and less space is now independent. You know, some of the media spaces we thought were independent, some stakes are being purchased by persons connected to the ruling elite. You know, recently we had shares purchased in one of the independent newspapers circulating in the country, and the implications of that are very clear. Once you have a major shareholder coming in who is connected to the ruling elite, it means also perhaps at some point the editorial policy of that particular newspaper also changes, and we are beginning to see less and less criticism in the so-called private media of you know, government and its policies, of also perhaps excesses from ZANU-PF political party. So those are the challenges that we are seeing. So, you know, the voices that we see nowadays are restricted to the social media, your Twitter, you know, and the like, and that is the space that is left for citizens really to engage. And it is vibrant, but again, as you indicated, how much surveillance is towards that, and what is the implication of the patriotic view to the exchanges on social media. Effectively, again, that would affect debate on the social media as people, especially those who are in country, may be circumspect in terms of criticizing policies, government policies here, fearing that perhaps we may end up in being accused of being unpatriotic and then charged for committing those acts. So the challenge is that the media space is shrinking, and as we are going into the election again, the fear is that less and less of space will be available for opposition political voices around election time or around election issues. They will not have space for them to air out their manifestos and the like. As much of the space will be occupied by the ruling ZANU-PF political party, as happened in the past.
If I could ask you, please, is one of the implicit or explicit justifications for closing down the political space and repressing opposition politics on the grounds that this has been stimulating ethnopolitics, political divisions between Shona-speaking or Ndebele-speaking communities across Zimbabwe, or is ethnopolitics not part of the complex mix inside the country?
I think there's less and less tribal challenges in the country. I think what we are seeing at the moment is really the politics taking center stage across the country. So when you go to Matabeleland, for instance, it is when there's political violence, it is not between the Shonas and the Ndebeles. It is between ZANU-PF coming in heavy-handedly on opposition political parties, party members who are simply having a meeting at a member's home, for instance, in Lupane, or we can get the same in Harare, for instance. We recently had 34 opposition political figures of the Citizen Coalition for Change, CCC, arrested while they're having a meeting at one of the members of parliament's homes. So this is the dimension that we are seeing. It's more political than is tribal. And what we have also seen is that there is now selective application of the law. When it happens to when opposite political figures meet to discuss their policies, they are arrested. But at the same time, when ZANU-PF is conducting its own political party activities across the country, including car shows, they are not arrested.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm sorry, I'm trying to make sure that I use the final 5 minutes to incorporate as many questions as possible. There was a question about the timeline for rejoining. The timeline for rejoining depends upon the assessment of the Commonwealth Secretariat's visit, which will then be put to Commonwealth member countries. It is not in the gift of any one particular Commonwealth country to decide yes or no, but that if a country or a group of countries does feel particularly strongly at the moment that the time is not yet right, they would have to articulate their opposition to this. The minister, Zach Goldsmith, of course, stood up in the House of Lords 2 weeks ago and articulated the British government's view that the time was not yet right. But as Brian has indicated, the dynamics within SADC are also very important in the discussion here. Colleagues, are there final remarks that you'd like to make? Brian, final comments that you'd like to make in the remaining 4 minutes?
Not really. I think I've said all I wanted to say. I just hope that we can get a new broader discussion going on this issue, which includes different levels of players. I doubt it's going to happen anytime before this election. And I think, unfortunately, what we're going to see in this election is another very problematic election process, which lacks credibility, but which will solidify ZANU-PF's current hold on the country, and will deepen the authoritarian politics that we've seen for decades in Zimbabwe, and that is unfortunately the case.
So you see a further contraction of the democratic space inside Zimbabwe?
Absolutely, it's already happening. It's already happening. It's underway. They've got all the legislative instruments they need to do that now. The opposition, unfortunately, is also having its own internal problems, its own democratic issues, its own structure problems, and that's not helping the situation. It's not clear their own position, for example, on the Commonwealth question or on international relations generally. So there are challenges. The fact that they've survived this long is itself shows the resilience of opposition politicians, but it has also created its own set of internal contradictions within the opposition politics itself.
Thank you very much, Brian. Lucy, any concluding remarks that you'd like to make to the discussion?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Brian. I think it's been a really interesting discussion. It's been interesting to have the different perspectives. I think just a couple of things from my point. One, I think it will be very interesting to see whether the Commonwealth does indeed decide to send an observer team to Zimbabwe. I think that will be something interesting to watch for. And I really also hope that the Commonwealth can continue to engage in a constructive way, because I do think that there has been a real benefits in terms of doing that. And I think the fact that these conversations and this engagement and this dialogue is still ongoing, I think we, you know, as an institution, I hope that we can continue to kind of engage in a productive way with Zimbabwe, with obviously in the run up to the election, post the election. I realize that that's going to be a very critical kind of moment on the timeline, and just really remembering you know, the huge kind of network of Commonwealth organizations that exist, whether there's even scope to come back to some of those kind of like discussions that we had a little while ago around what we can do to kind of support our kind of partners in Zimbabwe on an ongoing basis. Just to maintain those links and maintain those connections with Commonwealth citizens, because I think at that very local level there is a desire and a will to want to be part of that kind of wider international Commonwealth landscape, and whether there's scope for us to be able to do that. And obviously notwithstanding the serious kind of reduction in political space that we are seeing in Zimbabwe at the moment in the run-up to the election.
Thank you very much indeed. Andrew, your final thoughts, please.
Thank you, Lucy. For me, notwithstanding the lack of traction since the 2018 election in terms of the reform agenda, as ZESNI, we are on the ground. We continue to monitor and observe, you know, what is happening in the environment. We do deploy long-term observers who are there throughout the electoral cycle. So we continue to monitor what is happening and reporting what we see on the ground throughout the electoral cycle. Our electoral education and capacity building department will be running this year under the theme Vote in Peace, and we'll be conducting several activities to educate the public about this. We will be producing training manuals, you know, flyers and the like, and we'll also be having public meetings and radio and television programs around peace, so that at least we'll be able to improve the space before the elections happen, you know, July or August. And in terms of the electoral law reform, the bill is currently in Parliament. I understand that it will be debated tomorrow. But what I saw encouraging is the fact that the Portfolio Committee on Justice, when it went through the proposed changes to the law, is recommended to Parliament that they take into consideration the model electoral bill that ZESNI and other stakeholders put together and shared with Parliament. So we hope that they will take something out of it to improve the electoral bill, which must become law before the proclamation of an election by the president, because any changes after the proclamation of the date of the election will not apply in the election to come in August or in July or August this year. I thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Andrew. My sincere thanks to our expert panelists and to you, the audience, for your necessarily tough questions about this difficult issue of the current situation in Zimbabwe, the extent to which or otherwise that the country has instituted reforms, the way in which that the democratic space seems to be contracting, the economic problems which are besetting the country, all of which shows that the deeply problematic ways in which Zimbabwean citizens are being obliged to confront the challenges of day-to-day, but also their very governance. So I think that in terms of Zimbabwe's application to join the Commonwealth, the panelists have underlined that these are not simple issues. It's not a question of merely in or out, that there are multiple forms of engagement, soft engagement, as well as holding Zimbabwe to account by the recommendations of, for instance, the Motlanthe Commission, in addition to the Commonwealth's own standards as a self-declared values-based association. I think the dynamics have shifted within the Commonwealth, particularly with the admission of Togo and Gabon, which now, of course, includes 21 African members. So it is not simply the SADC dimension, but there is also the wider African dimension, which will come into play. I'm immensely grateful to our panelists for this wide-ranging discussion and for the airing of all of the issues. And I'd just like to bring this to a close, but to express my sincere thanks.